The morning sun was just starting to rise over the trees when Staff Sergeant James Cooper arrived at his favorite fishing spot. It was a quiet bend in the river, hidden away from the main road and about 10 miles from Fort Bragg. The spot was perfect. Not many people knew about it, and those who did usually didn't show up this early. Cooper parked his old blue Ford pickup truck under a large oak tree, making sure it was hidden from the main dirt road. He was dressed in simple clothes, worn jeans, a gray t-shirt, and his lucky fishing cap that he'd had since his father gave it to him 10 years ago. The cap was faded and had seen better days, but Cooper never went fishing without it. At 32 years old, Cooper looked younger than his age, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, too soon. 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless special combat training sessions had left their mark, not on his body, but deep in his soul. His friends at the base often joked that he could spot trouble from a mile away, a skill that had saved not just his life, but the lives of his fellow soldiers many times. The early autumn air was crisp and cool, making Cooper zip up his light jacket as he gathered his fishing gear from the truck bed. He had packed everything the night before: his favorite fishing rod, a tackle box full of carefully selected lures, and a small cooler with water, sandwiches, and some energy bars. The cooler also had space for any fish he might catch. He was hoping to get some bass today. As Cooper walked down the narrow path to the river, fallen leaves crunched under his boots. The path was familiar to him. He'd been coming here every chance he got since returning from his last tour 6 months ago. The doctors at the base had suggested finding a peaceful hobby to help with the transition back to normal life, and fishing had turned out to be perfect. There was something about the quiet of the river and the patience needed for fishing that helped calm his mind. He found his usual spot, a flat rock that jutted out slightly over the water, providing the perfect place to set up. The morning mist was still rising from the river's surface, creating a peaceful scene that looked like something from a painting. Cooper took a deep breath, enjoying the clean, fresh air, so different from the dusty air he breathed in Afghanistan. Setting up his gear with military precision, Cooper arranged everything exactly where he wanted it. The tackle box went on his right, within easy reach, but not in the way. The cooler was placed in the shade of a small tree to keep its contents cold. His extra fishing line and backup lures were stored in a small bag on his left. Everything had its place, just like in the military. The first cast of the day was always special to Cooper. He carefully attached a green and silver lure. Bass were active this time of year, and this was one of their favorites. With practiced ease, he sent the line arsing out over the water, watching as it landed exactly where he wanted it, near a fallen log where fish often hid. As he slowly reeled in the line, Cooper felt the tension leaving his shoulders. This was his time, his place of peace. Here, he didn't have to be Staff Sergeant Cooper, the decorated soldier with 3 tours under his belt. Here, he could just be James, a guy enjoying a quiet morning of fishing. The sun continued to rise, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Birds started their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance, a fish jumped, creating ripples in the calm water. Cooper settled into his familiar routine, casting and reeling, casting and reeling. He knew that sometime soon, the fish would start biting, but for now, he was content just to be there, surrounded by nature's peaceful morning symphony. Little did Cooper know that this peaceful morning was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't imagine, and that his military training would soon prove to be more useful than just keeping his fishing gear organized. The peaceful morning shattered at exactly 7:45 a.m. Cooper heard them before he saw them, the loud rumble of motorcycle engines echoing through the trees. His military training kicked in automatically, and his mind started marking escape routes and defensive positions, even though he tried to push these thoughts away. He was fishing, not in a combat zone, he reminded himself. 5 motorcycles appeared on the dirt path leading to the river. They were big bikes, mostly Harleys, covered in chrome and custom paint jobs. The riders were all large men, wearing leather vests with patches that Cooper recognized as belonging to the River Raiders, a local motorcycle gang known for causing trouble in the area. His friends at the base had mentioned them a few times, usually in stories about bar fights and harassment at local businesses. The bikers parked their motorcycles in a semicircle about 50 yards from Cooper's spot. The engines died down, but the peace of the morning was already gone. Cooper could hear them talking loudly and laughing, the sound of beer cans being opened mixing with rough language and jokes. He kept his eyes on his fishing line, but his ears were focused on every sound they made. The group consisted of 5 men, each looking like they belonged on a wanted poster. The leader, who Cooper mentally nicknamed Beard, was the largest, standing well over 6 feet tall with a massive gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. 2 others were shorter but muscular, wearing matching leather vests with numerous patches. The fourth was thin and wiry, with a nervous energy about him that reminded Cooper of the drug addicts he'd encountered during his military police training. The last one was young, probably in his early 20s, trying hard to look tough, but constantly looking to Beard for approval. They spent the first few minutes setting up what looked like their own impromptu party spot. Beer cans appeared from saddlebags, along with a portable radio that started blasting heavy metal music. The sound echoed across the water, surely scaring away any fish in the area. Cooper noticed they hadn't brought any fishing gear. They weren't here to fish. Cooper kept his position, appearing relaxed but staying alert. His training had taught him to observe without being obvious about it. He watched through his peripheral vision as the bikers started tossing empty beer cans into the river. The young one tried to hit him with a can, but it fell short, splashing into the water about 10 feet away. This caused a round of laughter from the group. The morning had grown warmer, and Cooper could feel sweat forming under his light jacket, but it wasn't from the heat. It was from the tension that was building in the air. He felt the same tension many times before, in alleys in Afghanistan and during raids on hostile compounds. It was the feeling that came before trouble started. Beard was watching him now, whispering something to the others that made them laugh even harder. Cooper could tell they were working themselves up, probably encouraged by the alcohol and their own tough guy images. He'd seen it before, people who mistake kindness for weakness, who think that being peaceful means being afraid. The fish weren't biting anymore, scared away by the noise and disturbance. Cooper started to consider packing up his gear and leaving, but his military instincts told him that turning his back on this group would be a mistake. Movement could trigger them into action, and staying still might just bore them enough to leave him alone. Time seemed to slow down as Cooper felt the situation approaching its breaking point. He could hear them moving around behind him, their boots crunching on the rocky shore as they spread out in what his combat-trained mind recognized as a basic flanking pattern. Whether they realized it or not, they were setting up for a confrontation. Cooper remained seated on his rock, his fishing rod held loosely in his hands. But his body was tensed and ready, his mind already running through scenarios and responses. The peaceful fisherman was gone now, replaced by the trained soldier who had survived 3 tours in one of the world's most dangerous places. He just hoped these bikers were smart enough to back down before they discovered exactly who they were trying to intimidate. The confrontation began with heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Cooper didn't need to turn around to know it was Beard leading the way, his boots crunching heavily on the rocky shore. The other bikers had spread out in a loose semicircle, something that might have looked random to others, but to Cooper's trained eye was a clear attempt to cut off his escape routes. "Hey, pretty boy," Beard called out, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and hard living. "Looks like you're sitting in our special spot." He stopped about 10 feet behind Cooper, close enough to be threatening but far enough to feel safe. Cooper noticed this detail. It showed that despite their tough act, they were still cautious. Cooper remained seated, appearing calm as he slowly reeled in his fishing line. His mind was running through combat scenarios, marking the positions of all 5 men. The young one was nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot on the left. The wiry one had picked up a thick branch and was tapping it against his leg on the right. The 2 middle-aged bikers had moved to cut off the path back to his truck. "I didn't see any names written on this rock," Cooper replied, keeping his voice friendly but firm. He turned his head slightly, enough to keep Beard in his peripheral vision without fully facing him. "River's big enough for everyone to fish where they want." This caused a round of laughter from the group, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from genuine amusement. It was the dangerous kind, the type Cooper had heard before, usually right before bullets started flying in dark alleys overseas. "You hear that, boys?" Beard called out to his friends. "City boy here thinks he can tell us about our river." He took another step closer, and Cooper could smell the mixture of beer and cigarettes on his breath. "Maybe we ain't made ourselves clear enough." The wiry one with the branch moved closer, swinging it like a baseball bat at his side. "Boss, want me to help explain it better?" His voice was high and excited, reminding Cooper of a wild dog eager to attack. Cooper finally stood up, his movements smooth and controlled. He turned to face them fully, his fishing rod held loosely in one hand. The bikers seemed taken aback for a moment. Cooper's height and build weren't as obvious when he was sitting down. His t-shirt stretched across shoulders built by years of military training, and his stance was balanced and ready, though he doubted they recognized these details. "Listen," Cooper said, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge of authority that made two of the bikers exchange uncertain glances. "I've been fishing here since sunrise. I'm not looking for any trouble, but I'm not looking to be pushed around either." Beard's face reddened at this challenge to his authority. He stepped forward again, entering what Cooper recognized as striking distance. "You trying to tell me what you're gonna do on our turf?" he growled. "Boys, I think this pretty boy needs a swimming lesson." The young one laughed nervously, trying to sound tough. "Yeah, boss, let's see if he can swim with those fancy fishing poles." Cooper's eyes scanned each man quickly, noting their positions and likely attack patterns. The wiry one with the branch would probably strike first. He was the most agitated. The young one would hang back, maybe throw punches from behind if he got brave enough. The two middle-aged bikers were the wild cards. They looked like they had experience in fights, but their slightly hunched postures suggested old injuries. "Last chance," Beard said, cracking his knuckles in what he probably thought was an intimidating gesture. "Pack up your gear and get out of here, or we're gonna have ourselves some fun." Time seemed to slow down for Cooper as he saw the supple shifts in their stances that signaled the coming attack. His body tensed imperceptibly, muscle memory from countless training sessions and real-world combat situations taking over. These men had no idea that they weren't confronting some random fisherman. They were about to attack a highly trained combat veteran who had survived situations far worse than this. Just as Cooper had predicted, the wiry one attacked first. He came in swinging the branch like a baseball bat, aiming for Cooper's head. But Cooper wasn't there anymore. With a fluid movement that spoke of years of combat training, he stepped inside the strike zone, the branch whistling harmlessly past his ear. In the same motion, Cooper's right hand shot out, grabbing the branch mid-swing. A quick twist of his wrist, using leverage techniques he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training, and the branch was no longer in the wiry man's hands. The biker's eyes widened in surprise as he suddenly found himself empty-handed. The young one came next, trying to tackle Cooper from behind while he was dealing with the branch. But Cooper had been keeping track of everyone's positions, just like he'd done countless times in combat situations. He shifted his weight slightly, causing the young biker to miss his target and stumble forward. Cooper helped him along with a gentle push, sending him sprawling into the wiry one. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs. "What the hell?" Beard shouted, his face turning red with rage. He hadn't expected this random fisherman to be so skilled. The two middle-aged bikers moved in from both sides, trying to box Cooper in. Their movements showed some street fighting experience, but to Cooper's trained eye, they might as well have been moving in slow motion. The one on the left threw a wild haymaker punch. Cooper blocked it with his forearm, the impact making a solid thudding sound. Before the biker could pull his arm back, Cooper gripped his wrist and used the man's own momentum to throw him off balance. A simple foot sweep, executed with perfect timing, sent the biker splashing into the shallow water of the river. The other middle-aged biker hesitated after seeing his friend go down so easily, but pride and alcohol pushed him forward. He tried a more cautious approach, throwing quick jabs instead of wild swings. Cooper blocked the first two punches and dodged the third. Then, almost casually, he caught the fourth punch and turned it into an arm lock. The biker found himself bent forward, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that sent sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. "Stop moving," Cooper advised calmly, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. "I don't want to hurt you." The biker nodded frantically, and Cooper released him with a gentle push that sent him stumbling away from the fight. Beard stood there, watching as his crew was systematically taken apart by this mysterious fisherman. The young one and the wiry man had managed to get back to their feet, but they kept their distance now, nursing bruised egos and bodies. The middle-aged biker was still in the river, sitting in knee-deep water and looking dazed. The other one was rubbing his shoulder, a look of respect and fear mixing on his face. "You're not just some random fisher, are you?" Beard asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. His hand moved toward his back pocket, where Cooper had already noticed the outline of a knife. Don't. Cooper said simply, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from real combat experience. You reach for that knife, and things will get much worse for you. His stance shifted slightly, ready to deal with the weapon if necessary. Beard's hand froze halfway to his pocket. For the first time, he really looked at Cooper, not just at his size and build, but at the way he moved, the way he stood, the calm confidence in his eyes. Recognition slowly dawned on his face. Military? Beard asked, though it wasn't really a question. Staff Sergeant, 3 tours in Afghanistan, Cooper confirmed. Now, we can either end this here, or we can continue. But I promise you, you won't like how it ends if we keep going. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Water dripped from the soaked biker in the river, and somewhere in the distance, a fish jumped, breaking the surface of the water with a quiet splash. The moment stretched out as Beard considered his options, his pride wrestling with his common sense. Beard's hand had stopped moving toward his knife, but his face showed he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Pride can be a dangerous thing, especially when mixed with alcohol and embarrassment. He looked around at his crew, one still sitting in the river, another nursing a sore shoulder, and 2 more keeping their distance after their failed attack. You think being a soldier makes you tough? Beard growled, trying to save face in front of his men. This ain't Afghanistan, soldier boy. This is our territory. His voice was loud, but Cooper noticed the slight tremor in it, the sound of a man whose confidence was cracking. Cooper remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Beard's face. You're right. This isn't Afghanistan, he said calmly. In Afghanistan, I was fighting people who were willing to die for what they believed in. You're just bullies who pick on people you think are weaker than you. These words hit Beard harder than any punch could have. His face turned an even darker shade of red, and his massive hands clenched into fists. The veins in his neck stood out as he struggled with his anger and his growing realization that he had picked the wrong target. Boss, the young one called out nervously from a safe distance. Maybe we should. Shut up. Beard snapped at him. Then he turned back to Cooper, taking a threatening step forward. Nobody talks to me like that. Nobody. Cooper didn't move back. Instead, he took one small step forward, bringing them face to face. Though Beard was slightly taller, there was something in Cooper's stance that made him seem larger. It was the difference between someone trying to look dangerous and someone who knew exactly how dangerous they were. Last warning, Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent riverbank. Take your friends and leave. Come back when you're ready to fish peacefully. The river belongs to everyone. For a moment, it looked like Beard might actually throw a punch. His body tensed, his fists raised slightly, but then he saw something in Cooper's eyes that made him hesitate. It was the same look Beard had seen in the eyes of his old drill sergeant years ago, before he'd been kicked out of basic training. The look of someone who had seen real combat and wasn't impressed by playground tactics. The wiry one, still keeping his distance, suddenly spoke up. Hey, Beard, man. I think I recognize him now. He's that guy they talked about down at Joe's bar, the one who took down 3 drunk Marines last month without breaking a sweat. This new information seemed to finally break through Beard's angry haze. His hands slowly unclenched, and his shoulders dropped slightly. The change was subtle, but Cooper recognized it immediately. The fight was going out of him. You could have hurt us bad, Beard said, his voice quieter now. Could have broken bones or worse. Cooper nodded. Could have. Chose not to. Like I said, I'm not here for trouble. Just wanted a peaceful morning of fishing. A fish jumped in the river again, as if emphasizing his words. The biker who had been sitting in the water finally stood up, water streaming from his clothes. The one with the sore shoulder had backed up to the motorcycles. Even the young one was slowly edging away from the scene. Beard took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. His hand moved again, but this time it wasn't reaching for his knife. Instead, he extended it toward Cooper. Name's Mike, he said gruffly. Most people call me Beard, though. Cooper looked at the offered hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. James Cooper, he replied simply. Listen, Cooper, Beard said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. We're gonna head out. But he hesitated, then continued. Any chance you could show me that arm lock thing you did? Been in plenty of fights, never seen anything that smooth. A small smile appeared on Cooper's face. It was the first time he had smiled all morning. Maybe another time, he said. When you come back with fishing poles instead of attitude. The sound of motorcycle engines gradually faded into the distance as Beard and his crew left the fishing spot. Cooper watched them go, maintaining his alert stance until the last rumble of engines disappeared completely. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly, years of combat training having taught him never to let his guard down too quickly. The peaceful morning had been disrupted, but somehow the aftermath felt different than the tense situations Cooper had experienced in Afghanistan. There, conflicts usually ended with injuries or worse. Here, he had managed to control the situation without causing any serious harm. It was a small victory, but an important one for a soldier still adjusting to civilian life. Cooper walked over to his overturned cooler and set it right. Some water had leaked out, but his sandwiches were still dry in their plastic bags. He collected his scattered fishing gear, checking each piece for damage. His lucky fishing cap had fallen off during the confrontation, and he found it near the water's edge, slightly muddy, but otherwise intact. As he cleaned up, Cooper thought about how differently things could have gone. In combat, split-second decisions often meant the difference between life and death. Today, those same quick decisions had helped him end a conflict without serious injury to anyone. His combat training had served him well, but in a way his instructors probably hadn't anticipated. The wiry biker's wooden branch still lay on the ground where it had fallen. Cooper picked it up and tossed it into the river, watching as the current carried it away. The splash attracted a curious fish, reminding him that he had come here to fish, not fight. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his commanding officer. Monthly training session today at 1400 hours. Don't be late, Cooper. He checked the time. It was only 9:30 a.m. He still had plenty of time to fish before heading back to base. Setting up his fishing spot again, Cooper noticed some changes in himself. His hands were steady, his breathing normal. In the past, after a confrontation, you would have felt the adrenaline coursing through his system for hours. But this time was different. Maybe it was because he had handled the situation with control rather than aggression, or perhaps he was finally learning to leave his combat mindset behind when it wasn't needed. The river had returned to its peaceful state, with birds starting to sing again and insects buzzing near the water's surface. Cooper cast his line, the familiar motion feeling even more therapeutic after the morning's excitement. The lure landed perfectly near a submerged log where he had seen fish earlier. As he slowly reeled in the line, Cooper heard the distant sound of vehicles on the main road. This time, instead of tensing up, he simply noted the sound and continued fishing. Not every approaching vehicle meant danger. That was something his therapist at the VA had been trying to teach him for months. A large bass suddenly struck his lure, and Cooper smiled as he felt the familiar tug on his line. This was what he had come here for. The fish put up a good fight, diving deep and trying to wrap the line around underwater obstacles, but Cooper's patience went out. After a few minutes of careful reeling, he landed a beautiful 5-pound bass. As he unhooked the fish and placed it in his cooler, Cooper thought about what Beard had said about teaching him some defensive moves. Maybe he would run into them again, but next time under better circumstances. After all, his commanding officer was always saying that the best way to prevent conflicts was to turn potential enemies into friends. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, warming the air and making the river water sparkle. Cooper checked his bait, adjusted his lucky cap, and cast his line again. There was still plenty of time for fishing, and now he could enjoy it with the satisfaction of knowing he had handled a difficult situation the right way. A week had passed since the confrontation at the fishing hole. Cooper sat in his office at Fort Bragg, finishing up some paperwork from the morning's training session. His phone buzzed with a text message from Joe, the owner of the local bar near the base. The message was simple. You might want to stop by tonight. Someone here wants to talk to you. Cooper had a good idea who it might be. Word had spread quickly about what happened at the river, the way stories often do in small military towns. He'd heard from other soldiers that Beard and his crew had been telling their own version of the story at Joe's bar, but surprisingly, they weren't painting themselves as the victims. After finishing his work, Cooper drove to Joe's bar. The parking lot had the usual mix of cars, motorcycles, and military vehicles. As he walked in, the familiar smell of beer and burger grease filled the air. The evening crowd was just starting to gather, a mix of soldiers, locals, and yes, bikers. Beard was sitting at the bar, nursing a beer. He looked different now, cleaned up, wearing regular clothes instead of his leather vest. When he saw Cooper, he raised his bottle in greeting. The gesture was casual, but Cooper could see the respect in it. "Sergeant Cooper," Beard called out, using his proper title. "Been hoping you'd stop by." He patted the empty bar stool next to him. The other customers watched with interest. They'd all heard the story by now. Cooper took the offered seat, and Joe immediately brought him a bottle of water without being asked. The bar owner gave both men a knowing look before moving away to serve other customers. "Your friend here's been telling me some interesting stories," Joe said to Cooper before walking away, "about how a fishing spot argument turned into a life lesson." Beard took a sip of his beer before speaking. "Been doing some thinking this past week," he said, his voice quieter than it had been at the river. "What you did there, how you handled things. It wasn't just about fighting skills." Cooper nodded, opening his water bottle. "Training isn't just about winning fights. It's about knowing when not to fight and how to end conflicts without unnecessary harm." "Yeah, figured that out," Beard replied. He turned on his stool to face Cooper properly. "You know, I was in the army too, way back. Never made it past basic training though. Had too much attitude, couldn't handle authority." This information surprised Cooper, though he didn't show it. It explained some things about Beard's initial hostility toward him. Sometimes the loudest tough guys were the ones carrying the heaviest regrets. "Got a nephew joining the Marines next month," Beard continued. "Been worried about him, to be honest. Kid's got a good heart but a hot head, like I used to have, like I still have sometimes." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "Was wondering if you might talk to him sometime. Share some of that wisdom about keeping cool under pressure." Cooper thought about it for a moment. This wasn't what he had expected when he got Joe's message. He had come prepared for anything from an apology to another confrontation, but not this. "I'd be happy to talk with him," Cooper said. "Might even be able to show him around the base a bit, give him a taste of what military life is really like." Beard's face lit up with genuine gratitude. "Appreciate that, Sergeant. Really do." He hesitated, then added, "And about that fishing spot. Me and the boys, we've been thinking of taking up actual fishing. Proper fishing, with poles and everything. If you're willing, maybe you could give us some pointers sometime?" A small smile crossed Cooper's face as he remembered his own words from that morning about coming back with fishing poles instead of attitude. Sometimes, he realized, the best victories weren't won with fists or combat techniques, but with patience and understanding. "Tell you what," Cooper said, "next Saturday morning, if you guys show up with fishing gear instead of beer, I'll teach you everything I know about catching bass in that river." 2 months later, the early morning sun rose over the same bend in the river, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. This time, Cooper wasn't alone at his fishing spot. 5 motorcycles were parked neatly under the oak trees, but today they were accompanied by fishing poles, tackle boxes, and proper camping chairs. Beard sat on Cooper's right, carefully threading a worm onto his hook, just as Cooper had taught him. The wiry one, whose real name turned out to be Tommy, was showing the young one, Billy, how to cast without tangling his line. The other 2 bikers, Mark and Steve, were already fishing downstream, their lines casting perfect arcs across the water. "Still can't believe how peaceful this is," Beard said quietly, not wanting to scare the fish. He looked different now, his beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore a proper fishing vest instead of leather. A small American flag pin was attached to his vest, a gift from his nephew who had successfully completed his first month of Marine training. Cooper watched as Billy finally managed a perfect cast, his face lighting up with pride when his lure landed exactly where he wanted it. The young man had changed too. He'd stopped trying so hard to look tough and had discovered that there was more satisfaction in learning a skill than in intimidating others. "You know what's funny?" Tommy called out softly from his position. "We used to come here to cause trouble because we were bored. Now we can sit here all day and never get bored at all." He had just landed his 3rd bass of the morning, proving he had a natural talent for fishing once he gave it a chance. Mark and Steve walked back up the shoreline, carrying their morning's catch. Both men had become surprisingly dedicated to fishing, often arriving at the spot even before Cooper. They had also started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping to maintain the building and grounds. "Hey, Sergeant Cooper," Steve called out, still using the respectful title. "Remember that arm lock you used on me that first day? Used to yesterday at the Veterans Center when we had to break up that fight between those two young vets. Worked like a charm, nobody got hurt, and both guys calmed down right after. Cooper nodded approvingly. He had eventually taught them some basic defensive techniques, but more importantly, he had taught them when and how to use these skills responsibly. The lessons had stuck better than anyone would have expected. Speaking of the Veterans Center, Beard said, reeling in his line to check his bait, "We're organizing that fundraiser next weekend. Got most of the local motorcycle clubs to agree to participate in the charity ride. Even got the mayor's approval for the parade route." This was perhaps the biggest change of all. The River Raiders had transformed from a group that caused trouble to one that helped prevent it. They still rode their motorcycles and looked tough, but now they used their reputation to do good in the community. Billy suddenly let out an excited whoop as his line went tight. Got one, he called out, trying to remember everything Cooper had taught him about landing a fish. Easy now, Cooper coached, watching with satisfaction. Let it run if it needs to. Tire it out slowly. The others gathered around to watch, offering encouragement and advice. After a few minutes of careful playing, Billy landed his first major catch, a 6-pound bass that would become the story of the day. As they all gathered around to admire the fish and take pictures, Cooper couldn't help but smile at how things had turned out. What had started as a potential fight had led to something none of them could have predicted: genuine friendship, positive changes in the community, and peaceful Saturday mornings spent fishing together. The river had enough room for everyone after all, just as Cooper had said that first day. As they released Billy's bass back into the river, Cooper had taught them about catch and release on their first proper fishing day. Beard turned to Cooper. "You know, some people might say you taught us how to fish, but truth is, you taught us a lot more than that." Cooper cast his line back into the water, a familiar motion now carrying the weight of all these positive changes. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to win a fight is to make sure it never happens in the first place."